정상 속도보다 빠르게 혹은 정상 속도보다 아주 느리게 들어보면 그 내용을 파악하기는 쉽지 않지만 오히려 그 언어의 고유한 억양과 소리에 더 예민해지기 때문에 더 쉽게 익숙해질 수도 있다고 하네요. 억지로 해석하지 말고 한번 편안하게 소리에 집중해 보시기 바랍니다.
What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking.
복잡한 문법이 아니라 간단한 원칙으로 영어 문장의 구조와 의미를 간단하게 파악하는 데 집중해서요. 영어 문장 구조가 결국에 이런 거구나 라고 느낄 수 있도록 연습해 봅니다. 자, 먼저 동사를 보면요. struck me, struck, strike, 때리다 라는 strike라는 동사의 과거 시제 struck이 보이고요. 그리고 was, 비동사, that 뒤에 또 was가 보이는데요. 앞에 나온 struck은 뿌리 동사가 아니죠. 뿌리는 비동사가 뿌리 동사입니다. struck은 what 뒤에 숨어 나온 거고요. what struck me 해서 나를 때린 것, 직역하면 그렇게 되죠. 나를 때린 것, 나를 놀라게 한 것, 그것이 was 뭐였냐면 that 이하였다. IQ was not the only difference. IQ, 지능지수만이 유일한 차이는 아니었다라는 사실. Between my best and my worst student. 가장 뛰어난 학생과 가장 성적이 나쁜 학생들 사이에서 IQ만이 유일한 차이는 아니었다는 거죠. 자, 그 다음 문장의 동사는 did not have, 갖고 있지 않았다. Some of my strongest performers, 가장 우수한 학생들 중에 일부는 did not have, 갖고 있지 않았대요. IQ 스코어인데 stratospheric, 굉장히 좀 고급스러운 형용사 단어가 나왔죠. strato는 stratum이라는 단어에서 나온 건데 이 층, 레이어를 얘기하는 거고요. spheric은 spare라는 구, 3009를 얘기하는 거죠. 지구 같은 거요. 성층권이란 뜻이거든요. 구름 저 위에 있는 성층권. 그러니까 엄청나게 높은 IQ 점수를 갖고 있는 것도 아니었다라는 거죠. 자, 그 다음 문장의 동사도 기본적인 거네요. weren't doing so well. 그렇게 잘하지 못했다. 누가요? Some of my smartest kids. 오히려 가장 머리가 좋은 똑똑한 아이들 중에 일부는 공부를 그다지 잘하지도 못하더래요. And 그리고 that 그러한 사실들이 got me thinking 나로 하여금 생각해 보게 했다. 뿌리 동사 그 다음에 think는 ing를 달고 변신했네요. got me thinking 그러한 사건들로 인해서 내가 생각을 해보게 됐다는 거죠.
What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking.
하루에 짧게 일부분만 집중해서 공부를 하고 대신에 매일 하루에 한 번씩 전체를 처음부터 끝까지 다 들어보고 다음 날에 이어서 일부분을 다시 집중해서 공부를 하고 영상 전체를 다 들어보고 자 이렇게 영상 하나를 다 보고 나면 뭔가 달라지겠죠? 자 일부분을 집중해서 공부를 해봤으니까요. 이제 전체 영상을 한번 편안하게 들어보세요.
When I was 27 years old, I left a very demanding job in management consulting for a job that was even more demanding, teaching. I went to teach 7th graders math in the New York City public schools. And like any teacher, I made quizzes and tests, I gave out homework assignments. When the work came back, I calculated grades. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. The kinds of things you need to learn in 7th grade math, sure, they're hard. Ratios, decimals, the area of a parallelogram. But these concepts are not impossible. And I was firmly convinced that every one of my students could learn the material if they worked hard and long enough. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. In education, the one thing we know how to measure best is IQ. But what if doing well in school and in life depends on much more than your ability to learn quickly and easily? So I left the classroom and I went to graduate school to become a psychologist. I started studying kids and adults in all kinds of super challenging settings. And in every study, my question was, who is successful here and why? My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future, day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. A few years ago, I started studying grit in the Chicago public schools. I asked thousands of high school juniors to take grit questionnaires, and then waited around more than a year to see who would graduate. Turns out that grittier kids were significantly more likely to graduate, even when I matched them on every characteristic I could measure, things like family income, standardized achievement test scores, even how safe kids felt when they were at school. So it's not just at West Point or the National Spelling Bee that grit matters, it's also in school, especially for kids at risk for dropping out. To me, the most shocking thing about grit is how little we know, how little science knows about building it. Every day, parents and teachers ask me, how do I build grit in kids? What do I do to teach kids a solid work ethic? How do I keep them motivated for the long run? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that talent doesn't make you gritty. Our data show very clearly that there are many talented individuals who simply do not follow through on their commitments. In fact, in our data, grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. So far, the best idea I've heard about building grit in kids is something called growth mindset. This is an idea developed at Stanford University by Carol Dweck, and it is the belief that the ability to learn is not fixed, that it can change with your effort. Dr. Dweck has shown that when kids read and learn about the brain and how it changes and grows in response to challenge, they're much more likely to persevere when they fail because they don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. So growth mindset is a great idea for building grit, but we need more. And that's where I'm going to end my remarks, because that's where we are. That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
영어 문장 속에서 동사가 등장할 수 있는 방법은 딱 세 가지밖에 없습니다. 뿌리거나 뿌리가 아니면 변신 혹은 숨어서 나오는 거죠.